Okay. Hi, Steven. Thank you for being with us.
Hello.
Could you start by telling us a little bit about your role as a researcher, kind of what you look into, and what you just generally try to keep track of in your
Sh-
work?
Sure. Well, I mean, I've been at PRA for coming up on 8 years now, and I've been looking at social movements which we can gloss as the far right. Of course, the far right now means the regime. So I look at the ways in which social movements of the right of one sort or another have managed to come together to coalesce in a we don't care about our minor disagreements yet. Let's take power of the state and use it to ensure permanent minority rule. Um, so political minority, and they have they're on the cusp of being able to achieve that. Although yesterday was maybe a tiny setback for them.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. And just because this is pre-recorded, I'll just name that yesterday was the election of Zohran Mamdani in New York City.
Yeah, and losses pretty much everywhere for the any candidate that was even in the little tiniest bit aligned with the MAGA movement or apologetic thereof. So I mean, I think that's we take that for what it is. We all know the value of elections, which is more than nothing and a whole lot less than what we need. Um, And so I look at, yeah, the ways in which social movements is shaped and social movement institutions have grown into ideological centers for promoting a exploitative, hierarchical and oppressive and authoritarian regime. And how that happened and what it means for us. I also spend a lot of time working with organizations to do scenario work, to think about how to respond, to do strategy formation, and helping them with sort of understanding the landscape that we are in now politically and culturally. I'm a cultural and political anthropologist by training. I spent many years overseas teaching and researching in Pakistan, in Germany, and in the UAE.
Let's start from the big picture question here, which is that as far as the general public is concerned, the general public has witnessed over the last 9 months or so this aggressive deployment of ICE, what feels like an unprecedented escalation of tactics, larger deployments, more aggressive arrests, masked raids, the brandishing and the firing of service weapons during these raids. Including the killing of immigrants who've been caught up in these aggressive attacks. What do you make of these changes? What should we make of these changes? Do they reflect a particular strategy or the influence of right-wing militias, white supremacist groups, or former military? How do you think, now that we have a quite a substantial amount of information, evidence, video of what's happened, how are you looking at this right now?
Well, I mean, the first thing to to grapple with is that yes, there is a change and it is significant and it is usually important in terms of shaping the politics of the United States as well as the lived experience of people caught up in it. Um, but of course, the vast deportation machine that exists was built under the Obama administration and then expanded and sort of spectacularized under the first Trump administration, and now even more so. So the first word I would throw out in terms of what we're seeing now, in spite of the real harm being done, is that the intent is spectacle. This is being produced almost like a Hollywood movie for the MAGA base. Uh, there is a something close to a majority of U.S. citizens who would like to see some kind of restriction on immigration based on what they know, which is frankly often not as much as they should know. Um, but very, very small minority, mostly in the MAGA base, who think that this kind of kind of Rambo-esque style enforcement is what we should be having, and quite a majority who see this as detrimental to our communities, and especially people looking out and seeing what's happening to their neighbors, seeing the extraordinary costs and the gloating from people in this world, both ordinary agents as well as the heads of agencies, kinds of behavior that would have frankly been seen as impeachable, or at least
Mhm.
pressure to resign from people even just a few years ago. I would kind of cowboy attitudes towards um, law enforcement that is already often either pushing at the boundaries of what is legal, is in defiance of or pushing up against defiance of court orders, and in many cases is clearly challenging constitutional principles, which at base include that basic due process rights under the Fourth Amendment for being secure in your person and your privacy, rights under the First Amendment for protest and gathering are being violated. And it's a systematic, besides being a spectacle for the base, it's a systematic effort to desensitize everyone, including
Mhm.
anyone who does watchdog work, including not just mainstream, but even alternative media, to this kind of brutality. Because you can only, even if you're completely opposed to every ounce of it, there's a limited number of hours in the day that you can spend watching and responding to brutality videos,
Mhm.
or tracking the number of lawsuits that are being filed to try to stop this, and somewhat ineffectually running up against the limits of our systems for control over the executive branch when it decides that it just doesn't care what the law says.
Mhm.
Congress is out to lunch, literally. They're not in session. The government is shut down, and yet this brutality machine that is centered around ICE, though in some cases we need not limit ourselves to talking only about ICE, because of course in Chicago things are being handed over to CBP. Why? Because the administration wants to set up a competitive situation between the agencies to see who can be more spectacularly brutal and
Mhm.
quote unquote efficient, meaning round people up regardless of what has happened and regardless of the pushback and regardless of who you get. So the idea that these are violent criminals, no, these are the easiest people they can find to arrest, regardless of even if they're in the country legally or not. So that's my first take. I'm sure I have much more to say about it, but in terms of people who are being attracted to this work, one thing to understand is that ICE, in particular, and the DHS services, the Department of Homeland Security services, are they lack the kind of professional prestige that goes with being in the active duty military or being a member of the FBI or something like that. So there are no real professional standards for them to be upholding. However terrible those things might be in a wider context, these are the people who joined with fewer credentials, with fewer expectations about what they were doing other than getting paid, and with no real tradition of something like having to follow international law or treaty obligations or uh, the Constitution. They were there to get a paycheck, and many of them are, of course, there to because they like the idea of official impunity, that they can do whatever they want and there's no consequences. And this is, exemplified by the fact that no one is being held accountable for these violent, unconstitutional actions, that they are over and over again, the representatives, the spokespeople for ICE and CBP are making things up, clearly
Mhm.
lying, demonstrated over and over again. And judges are quickly are saying over and over again, there's no evidence for what you are claiming, and substantial evidence for the people who are saying you are being arbitrarily or ideologically violent or partisanly violent. Of course, the shocking thing for a lot of people is that this violence is extending beyond the communities to which it has historically been concentrated. Not that they're not being targeted, they are, but also, quote unquote, respectable middle class white folk who are being caught up in this because they object to it.
I think it's really fascinating that you name the way the administration is seeking to pit agencies against one another. This isn't something I've thought about or seen reporting on before, but it makes a certain kind of sense. One question that I wanted to throw to you is about who is actually joining the ranks right now. There's, this big ugly bill, or the so-called big beautiful bill that was passed, and we know it's a massive infusion of money into enforcement, into ICE, and there's a huge recruiting effort underway. And many people on the left have speculated that it's going to be J6ers, it's going to be Proud Boys and other types of militia members who want to take up this kind of like spectacular violence, this appeal of impunity that you spoke of. I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on that? And if you know anything more than the kind of like hearsay and rumor.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, intuitively, it makes a certain sense that people in that world might be attracted to this, especially once you start talking about things like paying $30,000 or $50,000 bonuses to join. Um, but on the other hand, the J6ers and the Proud Boys are a relatively small number of people, and most of them who are part of the world, part of the world, are as the saying goes, all hat and no horse. So there will certainly be some of them who are going to be attracted, but what I would say is that we're looking at people who, in the absence of something like a Trump regime ICE surge, and just parenthesis, we're talking about increasing the size of ICE until it is bigger than the United States Marine Corps, to
Mm.
put that in perspective. Um, and seeing these agents out there, quote unquote agents out there, armed in ways that when the National Guard is deployed, they're not nearly so heavily armed as these ICE agents are and these CBP agents are, which is kind of astonishing. And of course, it goes back to a long history of buildup of militarization and law enforcement, but particularly amongst this crowd, this group that is supposedly dedicated to immigration enforcement, when the vast majority of people they are detaining have no history of any kind of any pretense of any history of violent activity. The worst that they're likely to do in response is run away. Um, and so we have then again the spectacle of rappelling from helicopters to land on rooftops to arrest people who do day labor out of a Home Depot parking lot. This is not just fascistic and uh, brutal. It is absurd. It is to the point of absurdity and dangerous on top of that. I mean, to justify an action like this, where you're flying Black Hawk
Mhm.
helicopters into an urban environment, the odds of a mishap are quite high, and this is unconscionable in so many different ways. Um, but anyway, people who are being attracted to it are people who would have flirted with the idea of joining the Proud Boys or becoming a militia person, but they had better things to do with their life. They were not going to get paid for that. It's the same ideological attraction, the same sort of adrenaline, hyper masculinity attraction, the same quest for impunity attraction, but they're getting paid. So this is going to attract a much wider swath. And you can see this in terms of just the people who are attempting to become members. The one thing that's been released uh, um, about the people who are volunteering to do this is that a lot of them they're having a hard time getting them through the training because of sort of physical fitness issues.
Mhm.
And I have no comment on any of not to downgrade anyone for that, but the fact that they're attracted to it in spite of that is the interesting thing that suggests to me it's a bigger pool of folk.
And Steve, I'm curious then if you could maybe clarify whether or not you think that the kind of blatant white Christian nationalism that Trump and Hegseth are have forefronted, and it's not just them, it's obviously Bannon, it's the whole kind of MAGA movement. Is it an actual effective recruitment strategy here? Even sans the financial incentives, which are significant, as you mentioned.
Yeah, oh, yes, of course. I mean, this is although it's important to understand that outside of the leadership cadre of Christian nationalism and by default white Christian nationalism, uh, there are very few people who are invested in the ideology. They see this like an ethnic identification. In other words, they these are many of these people, the polling is pretty clear on this, um, don't even go to church. They are invested in Christian nationalism in the sense that that's what it means to be American. And particularly in the same way that historically identities of whiteness were grounded in not being black, um, Christian nationalism is being now grounded in a new way, now that it's not just a taken for granted given, in being not being Muslim.
Mhm.
And so the attraction here is, oh, we can go and do something that serves this agenda of protecting the true Americans, the true people, the true us from this danger. Of course, there are Black folk who are involved in ICE. There are, you know, people who are not long back in the immigration past involved in ICE. So it's not all ideology, but it's also a way of bringing people who are attracted to this idea of belonging to something. That the actual entry barrier is very low. You only have to hate the same people that. And I'm not saying it's like I don't really go for the hate language because I think this is mostly about power for the leadership as
Mhm.
opposed to being about feelings, but it creates obvious targets of resentment. Just to summarize, there is absolutely an ideological component. The ideological component, I would say, though, is even more profound just in terms of maintaining a base that for the MAGA movement and for the Trump regime and for its sort of experimental and now entrenched installation at the level of state governance, that manages to bring together a cluster of anti-democratic, authoritarian, white nationalist, Christian, presumptive Christian nationalist forces we've had already in the state, many state legislatures and governments for 20 plus years now, going on 30 in some instances. Um, so it's this way that these ideas, you take the white nationalists and the sort of the ethnic isolationists, the people, the believers in a white civilization, white Christian civilization that is somehow superior and needs to be maintained against quote unquote immigrants and outsiders and non-white people. You add to them the Christian nationalists who are both afraid of other religious framings as potential competitors, but also insisting on maintaining or recreating or generating, really hierarchical gender relations and essentialist kinds of understandings of what gender is. Uh, Again, mostly as a power issue for maintaining male dominance
Mhm.
and patriarchy. Um, and then you
Yeah, that
have,
makes sense. You can see that in the I was doing just a little bit of cursory research into the ad campaign for recruiting officers to ICE and CBP right now, and it's extremely, there's so much hyper masculinity and this kind of like anti people of color, anti-indigenous imagery, the sort of valorization of women as the sort of the homeland, the hearth. It's very retrograde and kind of stunning that that's on a national stage. And there is something like to what you said about desensitization going on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, and I do wonder as well, like given I'm glad you surfaced this idea of the persistence of Islamophobia, and part of what we've also seen is in places like Los Angeles where the confrontations have included like Latinx immigrants kind of confronting ICE agents who are Latinx, right? Like they're either from the community or they identify them as such, and it's obviously way more complex than just white Christian nationalism. And I am curious, and maybe this is very difficult data to get on how these competing ideologies are, or these overlapping ideologies are at play as they're trying to also recruit this force at scale, given the influx of money, right? Like there are, as we know with the military also has disproportionately a lot of people of color are enlist because of class-based reasons, right? And the financial incentives there are obviously very important as well. So um, it's difficult kind of to grasp these what's going on internally because of how, as you mentioned to us before, we were talking about how opaque the information is about what ICE is doing and what their numbers are in terms of personnel.
Yeah, well, of course, historically and in other parts of the world, I did research. I did graduate research in Germany where, you had to fill out all of the correct paperwork, but once you got it done, you could do, pretty much open social science research with soldiers in Germany. And to a certain extent, that was also true in the United States. I mean, it was more hoops to jump through and more confidentiality requirements, but um, some people at least were allowed to do it if they were considered trustworthy or whatever. Um, Under the current circumstances under the Trump regime, they're trying to get even investigative journalists to sign non-disclosure agreements before they can, directly question Pentagon
You can't
officials.
be in the Pentagon. Yeah, exactly. The press
Right.
corps
Yeah.
is out of the Pentagon at this point, right? So
Right. Yeah.
I know you touched on this a little bit already, but I wonder if you can help us understand some of the distinctions between CBP, ICE, military forces, National Guard. There's been kind of like a jumble of um, getting these terms, kind of using them almost as synonyms, as we saw here in the Bay Area when we were expecting this massive deployment. I heard many people talking about National Guard troops are going to be in the streets. Which is not my understanding of what was happening. And then we see in a lot of these news stories about abuses in LA, in Chicago by federal enforcement troops that, or, I don't want to say the word troops, but agents, let's say, that they're all tarred as ICE, but many of them are actually CBP agents or officers. I don't know if this is how much you can kind of help us tease this apart, but whatever you can say about what those different forces are and if there are sort of hierarchies we can understand among them or between them.
Well, I mean, there's no official hierarchy between them in the way of like military ranks hierarchy. So on paper, these are agencies that serve different functions. So ICE is responsible for immigration enforcement any place in the United States. That's their remit. So they are centered on rounding up people who are in violation of immigration law, particularly people who are already registered in the system. In other words, they came into the country and requested some kind of review for asylum, or they're in the process of attempting to stay here permanently, some kind of legal adjudication in the separate immigration court system, which is a terrible system, by the way. It is already not as robust as the ordinary criminal and civil courts of the United States, and is much harder to operate in as someone who's been accused of violation of whatever. Um, but anyway, these people in particular that ICE is tasked with finding and deporting. I mean, in practice, uh, in principle, they should be making sure that these people are following the established administrative procedure, which would be to have a day with an immigration judge, however ineffective that might be. But there's a huge backlog, like years-long backlog of potential review of immigration cases. So by using the pretext of an emergency, the regime is just deporting anyone they can get their hands on or attempting to. In some cases, to third countries, not even back to where they came from. CBP is tasked officially with the border. So that is their remit. They are maintaining the border, patrolling the border, hence the patrol part of their acronym, and maintaining the official points of entry as well as other places of entry, and that is the basic distinction between them. The U.S. border, of course, is huge, and short of dedicating, a gigantic portion of the GDP to just stationing militarized troop stations along the border, effectively can't be 100% or even highly secured people. It's just not that hard to get people or things into the country without official permission. It's also self-defeating. Since the people who are trying to get things here that are actually harmful, or the people who are actually harmful, are exactly the ones who will go to the greatest lengths to circumvent any border enforcement or customs enforcement that you do. There are arguments about why you should do some, and I don't think we need to get into that at the moment. The point being that there are other elements of all of these, of ICE and CBP, other elements within the Department of Homeland Security where these fall under, that are defining border control and immigration control as primarily a security issue, as opposed to primarily a humanitarian issue or a rule of law issue or a economic issue, which all three of which it is. But they're looking at it through one lens, the lens of guns, essentially. How can we deploy guns to make it so miserable for people? This is what is referred to as attrition strategy. And it was actually posed by the anti-immigrant movement many years ago as how we should make it so miserable for folk who are in the country without documentation that they leave. Self-deport, as it is called. And so that is the idea. But both agencies then have a different command, but all together going back to the leadership of Department of Homeland Security. And so they can be, since they have a separate chain of command, they can be pitted against each other in terms of how willing they are to go the extra mile to do whatever it takes. This is military language for stop worrying about human rights, stop worrying about rule of law, grab as many people as you can and get rid of them. And
Can I ask
so,
a follow-up about this?
yeah.
There's been a little bit of rhetoric around politicians in California, Nancy Pelosi, Gavin Newsom, speaking about, if these federal agents step out of line, they'll be arrested by local law enforcement. And I've seen just this week out of Durango, Colorado, a similar kind of at least rhetoric around trying to hold accountable these federal forces by municipal and local law enforcement forces. Like, do you have any sense of whether something like that could happen? And if so, what would be the impact?
Yeah, it could absolutely happen. And in fact, it's in order to, because keep in mind that for the regime, as much as the vulnerable people are, as always, receiving brunt of the violence. The point is not to beat up brown people, to be, coarse about it. It's to destroy the opposition base. And so, their priority, they want to see Gavin Newsom in handcuffs. I mean, Gavin Newsom, I think, is a terrible person, and that's my point of view.
Yeah, we're
But
going to agree with you on that. Yeah.
but they want him in handcuffs. And the the principle of supersession means that a federal agent can certainly be arrested for private crimes. So anything they do when they're not in uniform
Mhm.
or on the job. But it's very difficult to assert local jurisdictional authority over a federal agent who is breaking the law because they have a certain amount of practical impunity. It's not necessarily immunity, but they have practical impunity
Mm,
because whoever arrests them can then subsequently be charged potentially with something like obstructing
obstruction.
federal
Yeah.
justice.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah.
And so you really have to be willing to get into a messy constitutional fight when you know the federal courts are rigged
Mm,
against
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. I just want to highlight this point that you just made about the point here is to break the opposition. I think that's a really key thing for us to be thinking about in this moment, that immigrant communities are being used as pawns in this sort of larger battle or strategy from the right.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the base wants the immigrant communities to be broken and got rid of,
Sure.
but the regime, in order to maintain permanent power, um, when it's increasingly looking like they're going to be unable to win anything that looks like an even quasi-fair election, is going to require
hmm
these kinds of pressure moves. Um, and whatever we think of Newsom, he is very publicly pushing back against the regime. And this is exactly the kind of person they consider to be a traitor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also think it's really notable that you've identified the kind of structural impunity that the federal law enforcement has. I think for for everyday folks, right? Like the kind of the general zeitgeist is like we're dealing with like some retrograde Nazism, like the return of this. And in some ways, there's some truth in terms of like the ethos, right? Like it's not lost on us that they, whether it's the Heil Hitler stuff or any of the kind of signals that anyone from Bannon to Hexeth has like made publicly, that that's part of the lore and culture around the MAGA movement in some way, shape, or form, even though it's the coalition itself is far more diverse. Um, but I do think that a lot of folks see this impunity, which is so obvious and includes like very public instances of saying, racist comments or threatening people or using physical force, like slamming into somebody's car and dragging them out by their feet. That they're like, well, arrest them, right? Like this is the kind of quintessential like reflex, right? Like who's going to do something? Who's going to stand up? And I want to, this brings me to this question, Steve, which I think is an important question about where we're headed. And
Mhm.
I think you kind of framed this early on that like this is still in process, right? We're talking about ICE and CBP that has taken decades to turn into the force that it is today through several administrations, including a Republican and Democratic administrations, and most recently Obama. These are not bureaucracies and administrative bodies that can just suddenly be completely overhauled like overnight. And so there's a larger process, dialectical one, if I could say, of like the transformation of this um, uh, this paramilitary operation into something else. The question, the $1 million question is, people have said this, and it's become somewhat common parlance or throwaway line. Is there a danger that this is going to become, or that it has already become, a private army or a secret police force for the Trump regime?
It is,
And yeah,
yes.
Yes,
It
and
is
I think that
absolutely.
yeah, and so I think that, yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on where this you think this is headed with CBP and ICE.
And other smaller components of other smaller agencies that are little in the news and have little public profile. Um, they have not yet crossed over the boundary toward to being the operatives who would, for example, although I should almost not even say this, but it's still the FBI that is doing the wider um, uh, implementation of investigation around issues like these nebulous issues like conspiracy, like this apparently invented and invented situation in Dearborn where you have the FBI raiding a house full of Muslims and saying, "Oh yeah, they were about to be engaged, and there's engaged in some kind of terrorist activity," and then claiming credit for stopping it. And unlike in other cases that, however dubious they were in using sort of entrapment and provocation to trick people into saying they were going to do something violent, in this case, it doesn't even seem like they had that threshold. It's basically, they interpreted some random rhetoric to be, oh yeah, this is an incipient terrorist plot. We have to swoop in and stop it. Um, but the FBI, the difference between the FBI and even more so the standing military, these are separate agencies, and they are agencies with deep traditions that actually care about the respect of the citizenry at large. Not that they don't see themselves as a part, not that there isn't a barrier, not that they don't have deep histories of abuse, but there's some restraint. ICE has no identity other than we are the people who take care of those bad immigrants for you. Same with CBP. They're both relatively new institutions. I mean, there was always Border Patrol previously, but the creation of these new entities specifically in the post 9/11 and era under the Department of Homeland Security, made them into something different and something that was from the inception designed to be extraordinary, designed to be facing towards an expectation of the next 9/11. So when you have that expectation, you're leaning into extraordinary circumstances that justify almost any level of violence and torture and arbitrary detaining people and violation of constitutional principles on the grounds that we are at war with these people. Now, the fact that most Americans, most people in this country see this as absurd, that we're at war with immigrants, is kind of beside the point to them. This is how the orientation works, and this is what those ads that you were, Chica, you were pointing to earlier, that have these kind of Aryan values, Aryan masculinist values, where the point seems to be we have to defend the women folk from these horrible terrorists and rapists and people who are forcing our children to take drugs. Um, and of course, this tiny, tiny percentage of people who come into this country without documentation, and much more common types of behaviors from people who were born here and from all different kinds of backgrounds. Um, so, regardless of any of that, uh, these these kinds of um, identity issues amongst these organizations point to the fact that they are being conceived of in the center of the regime as a kind of party. And the party isn't Republican here, it's MAGA.
Mm.
And as a MAGA army, sort of like the SS was in the Third Reich. Um, which doesn't mean that they won't also try to use them then by giving them funding, but giving them privileges, them being ICE, uh, 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 CBP, giving them privileges, giving them rewards.
Mhm.
Then they can, try to suck the FBI, suck the Marshal Service, suck and then suck and push, of course, because the leadership of all of those organizations has already been compromised by appointment of incompetent ideological hacks.
Right.
Military is a much bigger, if ICE is an institution that is going to be slow to change and slow to change back, military is a completely different kettle of fish in terms of scale. It has institutional inertia, which wants it to basically keep doing the same thing. It took decades just to get it to stop fighting the Cold War after the
Yeah.
collapse of the Soviet Union.
Stephen, you said that, I think if I understood you correctly, you said that ICE has not yet tipped over into this danger zone where they are just the standing secret police or MAGA army, but they're sort of tending that way.
It's more than tending. I mean, I think they're leaning hard, and there's not really any effort to internal effort to stabilize and push back, because anyone who had any interest in pushing back was um, fired or quit. So basically, you have people who are the only breaks are external, and maybe from people, some people in sort of middle management who are like, well, I don't really care, but there could be a war crimes or crimes against humanity tribunal if this regime ever comes to an end, and I don't know that I want to be
Mm.
involved in that.
Mhm.
And so they're stepping cautiously towards this role, whereas some they're counterweighted against people who are rushing towards it. And you can always make the most spectacular and brutal enforcement zones more of a volunteer basis, or guide people who are the rushers towards that, and put the people who are stragglers, you may still keep them on because they need people, but put them at a desk, have them do paperwork, whatever.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I think it's more than a slight lean. I think that they are on the precipice, and the thing that they're not yet doing is they're not being sent to do universal enforcement outside of their own um, uh, uh, constitutional remit, their own legal remit. So they're not being sent to arrest city councilors who still support sanctuary in
Mm.
Portland.
Okay, yeah, yeah. Can you say anything about what you think we should be doing on the left to halt and turn back this progress toward this kind of like worst outcome?
Well, I mean, this is a really, of course, tense and difficult question, but it's really, we're in a moment where what we have is noncompliance at every step, and supporting people who are not complying. So this is the task to inform people, to warn people about ICE, to inform people who are protesting about their rights. I mean, and to try to keep people operating in a relatively um, safe way. By safe here, I mean not letting, encouraging people who have the most capacity and the most privilege to be on the front lines of pushing back, and those who are typically most likely to be involved in, say, street level protest, who are vulnerable, not to disengage, but to yeah, why don't you do the mutual aid, food distribution, and the helping to get people around, and let someone else get hit with tear gas and arrested, because they will probably be released in 24 hours, at least till now. But you, with your you know um, lack of white skin privilege, and likelihood that highly increased likelihood that ICE agents will make the claim, true or not, that you were resisting arrest and violent, and therefore need to be kept in custody until a trial that may or may not happen. So movement security, organizational security, non-compliance, and not letting it become normal, any of it, because it's not normal. I
Yeah.
mean, it wasn't normal in, the Jim Crow South, and we need it not to be normal in, uniformed abduction uh, of people, residents of the United States. I wanted to say another thing about the institutional, the structural issues, because of course, one of the reasons we have the structural issues that we have between this federal government and the states and localities is historically it was the states and localities that were violating people's
Hmm.
individual rights and community rights and claimed the right to do that based on their quote unquote traditions and up to and including lynching. And it was the federal government, oftentimes, always reluctantly, but sometimes under court order, who were not willing to intervene just to stop the violence, but were willing to intervene if a court told some Mississippi or whoever that you have to stop that. And Mississippi said, no, we refuse. Then at that point, they were insubordinate. And so here comes the 82nd Airborne. Here comes, President Eisenhower sending federal troops to Arkansas. And of course, this goes all the way back to Reconstruction.
Yeah, and we find ourselves now in an inversion where it's
Exactly.
states interested in
Yeah.
maintaining communities and the federal government interested in impunity and disobeying court orders. It's a scary time. It's a sobering moment.
Yes.
Steve, I really appreciate you joining us for this. Maybe we want to close out with one final question, and your answer can be brief, but I do think that I'm curious, since you have a long view at this, about the question of time. How much time do we have, or how we look at this from social movements about the immediacy and urgency of how we need to act, and especially if we're talking about working in a united front with people that we don't necessarily see with eye to eye. I think it's helpful to maybe think about the mileposts that you're looking at. I would say that part of what you've already done is to answer the question by saying, like, the immediate task is to work at the local level, and non-compliance, starting with people who are the most vulnerable, is something you can do immediately. But what about your view of time more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, the midterm elections do matter. The elections that just happened yesterday matter. They as mileposts, as indicators of how effective the interventions of the regime and the center of the MAGA movement are going to be. Now, erasing even the damage done by the regime in this first 9 months of its nominal authority is going to take years or decades to reverse. Of course, it doesn't help that the system that they are breaking was already a raggedy ass system and a non-democratic system in any way that we would want it to be. But when you start with a broken down old house and then you take a torch to it, some people may say, well, we should burn it down. And I'm like, no, if we burn it down, that doesn't mean we're going to win. It means that people even worse, are waiting to take the reins of power. Yeah, so people, I encourage people to be involved um, in the standard political thing, but in the longer term, I'm saying, like, okay, we need our own political party, or like the far right did with the Republicans, we need to take one. They said, we don't like what they're doing, they're not racist enough, let's just take it over. Um, and they made a 5-decade plan to do that. But the immediate task is, yeah, midterms, 2028. All of these governors and mayoral and city council elections, we have to contest them all. And we have to not swallow a bunch of Democratic Party nonsense about the way to win is to tacking towards agreeing with the regime as much as we can. Just say we're going to do it less. That
The
didn't work.
Republican fight,
Yeah.
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 There's no, I mean, pundits continue to say this stuff. I think that results from yesterday go contrary to that. And I think a understanding about what mobilization looks like. There really are more people who are against this regime than who are for it. by an order of magnitude, a third of those people just didn't vote in the last election because they didn't see much of a choice. And for good reason. So I think that, we can't make people trust things that are untrustable, and that'll just make us look like hypocrites. But we have to, and we can't just say, hold your nose and do this. We'll say, let's find something that you can support and get on board with it. And if you really just can't, then no one should twist your arm and make you. In fact, that's contrary to any kind of democratic principle. Find some kind of local efforts to be involved in that still demonstrate that there is resistance. And of course, we're looking at the potential, the potential of general strikes and boycotts and other kinds of actions in the next year or two, as well as solidarity actions and formation of rapid response networks and things that can be iterated. I mean, I can see the kinds of rapid response that have happened in Chicago and other places being, intentionally copied in other parts of the country. And it doesn't just have to be because there's ICE on the ground. This can be extended to other kinds of resistance against the carceral state.
It's a great point to end on, I think. Thank you so much, Steven.
Steven, thanks for being with us. We appreciate you.
Great to be here. Thank you so much.